Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Right. Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Understand that the model will work like this. If the government is giving you a public fund for you to complete your research and for you to go through the scientific research, the clause will say that you cannot patent that product. So that's how the model will look like. But first of all, why are these patents there in the first place? Because these sorts of research are extremely exclusive, right? Which means it's extremely hard to replicate and duplicate, which means the only possible way to get this information about this research is to either buy the patent or to make this patent or to eliminate this patent as a whole. So if the opposition comes up and tells you there's like alternative ways to get this information and firms will try to shift to those alternative ways, that's not possible. Secondly, the patent puts you on a map, right? It gives you motivation. It gives you like a charge to innovate and to make your scientific research better. If we can prove to you similar incentives that firm still has, I think we can get the debate. But first, some few clarifications, right? The private funds and the private research will still exist. So you cannot say that those private corporations will stop their innovation. And secondly, we tell you that the incentive will still stay within this individual, within these firms in general, right? So if we can prove to you that the benefits of the patents will largely be still there and the trade-offs are not very important because inaccessibility of these information and this research disproportionately harms a minority, I think we win this debate. Yes. Go for the POI.
So currently you have to be peer reviewed in your research for a certain drug. You have to do multiple longitudinal tests right now for testing out a certain scientific product. Can you explain to us why that doesn't mean that there's some level of transparency and accountability for information that's put out?
There's still going to be things like I don't necessarily think that you're going to make the entire research and change the entire dynamic of how the research works, right? By not giving the patent. I don't think all the things that you do in a research is not contingent upon if you can make like put a license or put a patent on it, right? So I don't understand how that works. But first of all, understand that where do these public funds come from? They come from the tax revenue, right? Which means the entire idea of the principle of reciprocity from the tax revenue still stays, right? It means when the government gives you certain rights, you give them certain forms of taxation, which means if you use this tax money and if you use this taxpayers' money, you have to give them something in return. So in general, in principle, we think if you fund these projects with the taxpayers' money, you have to give them the accessibility to this information. And secondly, the idea of redistribution, right? Like the government uses this tax money to help the most vulnerable, right? Which means decreasing inequality, creating more accessibility, etc. So in comparative, if you have a world where this patent exists, the cost of innovation increases drastically, which means that this innovation is always entrenched into the hierarchy where the poor cannot reach, right? Which means you are not creating redistribution, but you're increasing this hierarchy of innovation in general. So we think it's principally justified for the government to eliminate these forms of patents because they're using the taxpayers' money and exclusively because it's being publicly funded. But secondly, why is accessibility important, right? Accessibility is important for a number of reasons. First of all, because it simply makes your life easier, right? So if there's scientific research about things that makes your life easier, like life-changing drugs or better efficient energy tools, the reasons why it is important for you to have access to those information and have access to those products, irregardless of your arbitrary reasons, right? Because if you are in a developing country and if you are arbitrarily not having that information because of the arbitrary metrics, then I think that is not principally justified, not taken. Because the patent itself is an arbitrary metric too, right? The reason why you can put that patent is because you are already privileged. You already reached that level of privilege where you could perform that research, where you could perform all these sorts of field work and all these sorts of information, have all these sorts of technology, and then put out that patent, right? So we think in general, this itself is like taking you to the inequality, and we think that you should have higher access to it. But secondly, in developing countries, even if we have access to these sorts of like information, and even if we have access, because patent doesn't necessarily mean inaccessibility, right? It just means you have to pay a lot of money to get it. But we're still significantly dependent on the imports of other countries, right? We're still significantly dependent on other richer countries to give us those sorts of information, to give us those sorts of access. So in either circumstances, if there is any change in the supply chain, if there's any disruption in the supply chain, we are disproportionately harmed, and we think that accessibility should be there. But thirdly, innovation in developing countries is already extremely difficult, right? Because of the structural problems that exist, right? So because of like less amounts of universities willing to do research, or less amounts of funds that are there for you to conduct those research, et cetera, et cetera. So the only alternative that these universities and these developing countries have for innovation is to take on already existing research and scientific research in those specific like parts, and get those specific niche information from the existing research that already exists, right? Or else it's extremely difficult for them to compete with the overarching globalizing world and innovation that is already happening, right? The reason why developing countries are so far behind the already innovative worlds that are happening is because of this inaccessibility. Fourthly, we think that scientific research is extremely unique in general, right? Which means it can uniquely benefit your economy. It can uniquely benefit the politics and social mobility that a country has, right? So it is absolutely necessary for you to have this sorts of information and the scientific research to uplift the life, right? The nuance here is important because every specific scientific research that are happening currently are not extremely generalized, right? So the reasons why developing country cannot develop further is because of the like lack of nuance in their research. And the only possible way you can do that, and the only possible way, and the only reason why you probably patent a certain scientific research is because of the detail and is because of this nuance. So we think those nuances are important to literally make your economy and politics better. But fifth, we think that universities in developing countries are already failing to give their students higher accessibility to information and research, right? Because these students are getting lower tier jobs because they're lacking behind the amount of research and information that they can do. We think that this is a systematic entrenchment of these students in these developing countries, and they deserve like a sort of upliftment from this entrenchment by having access to this information, right? My second speaker will tell you why the competition in these sorts of market still stay, and we're very proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for their speech. I'd like to invite the Leader of Opposition.
Mic test, can you hear me? Take my POIs solely via chat. I do not accept anybody who unmutes themselves. Just a word of warning. Let's rock and roll in 3, 2, 1. The first and maybe the most important thing I'll do for you in this debate is define for you what is a patent. Because it's not about keeping information secret. Patents are essentially a trade-off agreement between private companies where they go, we will tell you how we produce this good, we will show you the ways that we synthesize this drug, we'll teach you how we develop this technology. In exchange, and we'll do it in very high levels of detail, in exchange, because you know what that level of detail is, any company which tries to copy us, you will sanction them with punishments via law. You will force them to buy a contract from us before they're allowed to copy it for a period of about 20 to 30 years, after which the patent expires and all of the information becomes public property domain for anybody to use. So the question in this debate is not, as opening government asserts to us, a question of who allows access to the most amounts of information held by private companies, because patents are the only unique mechanism which allows all those private companies to publicize that information with guarantee that they'll make money because they have a monopoly on using that research for 20 to 30 years, and so thus are incentivized to make that good. I think in comparison, what we'd likely see in a world where they propose, when patents are very open, we would see a world where more and more companies resort to trade secrets. This is to say, they don't strictly patent it, which means that if someone tries to copy you, there's no legal repercussions, but they just don't tell you how it's made in the first place, so you don't have a way to copy them. And I think that that's the worst world to live commitment if they want to care about the question of who gets access to research for the nations which can't access them. But I think the second question that you need to answer, what they try and force upon us, is this principle of, well, taxpayers pay tax, so therefore they should have a benefit out of it. And yeah, obviously that's true. But clearly what the benefit is if you pay tax for a company to research cancer-saving drugs, then the benefit is that eventually one day you'll get cancer-saving drugs as a result of that research, right? So therefore what you ought prioritize is who can create the most goods and who can incentivize the creation of these most goods most efficiently. I think that we perfectly fulfill our principle. Why? Well, the first thing that we do is we are a team that maximally incentivizes companies for accepting public funds. We think that on their side of the house, obviously public funding comes with the caveat that you have to also make public your inventions and allow any other company to copy you. You probably will either not make that good or not accept a public fund. And that's horrible on several fronts, right? Because first of all, understand why patents are so important for a company to be able to produce something of value. Because obviously it takes time and research development money to be able to produce something of value, right? Like if it takes you 50 years to discover go through various clinical stages of trial, test out various synthesis combinations for a certain bunch of chemicals to figure out if this has an effect on treating cancer or something, and you finally get it to market, but then another company which didn't do all of that research, hasn't sunk all that cost into it, starts producing your good, you're obviously going to lose out to that company, and therefore you're incentivized to just never start investing research into research and development when it's so much more lucrative to copy off everybody, which means that it's going to be very, very difficult for you to incentivize private companies to want to start creating things in a world where patents are expected to be public. We think to the extent that you are then forcing upon them an additional burden of having to evaluate whenever you accept a public funding, whether or not this would be good for their public monetary goals, I think it creates an extremely dangerous precedent. Because it means for situations like COVID, where we needed to fund companies like Pfizer with as much government money as fast as possible so that they can produce the vaccine as fast as possible so that everybody can get better as quickly as they can, it means that Pfizer is much more likely to say, no, because if we accept that money, then we're going to lose all the profits of the vaccine that we would make. We would much rather take an additional 1 or 2, 3, 4 months, don't accept that money and get all of the profits that we'd make later, which means to the extent that you're tying public funding and tying the very good outcomes alongside to companies and artificially slowing down companies from being able to produce the results that we need, we say that it is damaging for the population. We say that instead, what you ought to do is you just ought allow those companies to make the money and produce the drugs as fast as possible. But I think the second thing is this is much worse for developing nations, right? Because it means that all of the money that they spend, incentivizing companies and publicly funding companies to make great drugs and all of that sort of stuff, and India is one of the largest vaccine producers in the world. I'm sure they do quite a lot of research. All of that money you spend, a richer nation is just going to say, great, we've seen you've done the research, we've seen you produce the drug, there are no patents on this shit because it's all publicly funded. I'm going to take that, I'm going to make a better version, I'm going to outcompete the Indian market because you have no patents on that. I think to the extent that that is true, obviously it means that public funding, which is a vital way that people in specifically developing nations are able to create and develop the drugs that they are useful for their society, we ought protect their ability from being snaffled off by people with greater means. I'll take a POI from closing.
So just to be clear, who exactly do you want to hold these patents and how do you want them to use them? Or how are you going to make sure they use them in that way?
I mean, obviously, it's just status quo, right? Private companies hold patents for about 20 to 30 years, after which the information goes public. For that 20 or 30 years, they have a monopoly on drug production. Obviously, they're going to want to maximize that drug production to make as much money as they can in the 20 to 30 years that they get an artificial monopoly for. So clearly, they're going to try and make it so that everybody has maximal access to that drug at their prices. The only difference is that obviously you buy from them, you spend all your money at that company, rather than having it being snaffled off by another company. And I think the second question that you really need to consider is I think that this disincentivizes government from funding public research to begin with, right? Because it's important to understand that as the government of, say, India or China or Australia, you don't just throw money at research institutions in the vain hope that it'll magically make things better. You do it so that your individual, your companies your companies and your country's companies and your country's people are able to profit out of it, right? When that means that if you fund something as the Australian government or you fund something as the Indian government, that like, oh, I funded it, so now your private company has to sell this, like have no patents on it, anybody across the world could steal this. What that then results in is it results in a world where governments go like, well, then what's the point, right? Like, even if we fund all of this research, it doesn't particularly benefit our nation in a meaningful capacity. Other nations just keep snaffling off the research, keep stealing it, keep producing cheaper versions than it, because we don't have to offset the research costs. As a result, it means that your governments are much less incentivized to want to fund research, who get much less funding in general. The final point, which Joel might or may not expand on, is we think that just generally decreases the amount of government oversight that you have over this fund. Obviously, due to being public funds, the government has an incentive to make sure that funding is ethically and efficiently being used, which means that there are, to avoid voters rioting when they find out that it's being tested on animals or something. To the extent that that is true, what that means is they have greater levels of oversight than a private company would. When you take away the ability for governments to fund, or when you take away the incentive for private organizations to accept public funds, that means they're much more likely to go behind closed door, much more likely to be much less ethical. So proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Before I start, can I just request everyone to please turn off their videos because I have shitty internet. Thank you, and I will only be taking POIs via the chat. With that being said, starting in 3, 2, 1, go. I think it's important to note how dismissive the previous speaker was in terms of all the arguments we gave to you, that how the most vulnerable within the society are the people who needs to have an increased amount of cost if they want to access these goods, which are, by the way, publicly demanded goods, right? I think they ignore all of it and they keep on bashing on the point that, oh, now we have more innovation, but they never engage with the trade-off that the people who are innovating are people who are already coming from rich and privileged backgrounds, and the amount of money that will probably create any sort of change for those people are likely to be lesser in terms of the people who are the most vulnerable within the society, right? But more importantly, I think they probably give us a very ingenuous trade-off in this debate. Their argument is that either you as a private corporation will reject all sorts of public funding, or you will not make the good anyways to begin with. But at the same time, I think you need to look at the motion first, right? These are talking about researches that are publicly funded. Why would a government invest in a research to begin with, right? Why would it be publicly funded? If not, there is huge demand for it and everybody probably requires it, right? These are those sorts of goods, probably life-saving drugs or research that makes your economy better. This probably looks like things as green technology, or this looks like research on things like how you can automate better so that your companies can also keep up with the industrial revolutions, right? Which means the conclusion of this particular characterization is whatever research we're talking about are not niche research. These are publicly demanded and everybody wants it. If this is the scenario, then why do companies still have an incentive to keep on innovating, right? I think it's specifically because of the research, right? Because capitalism is going to exist either ways. And if capitalism exists, every time there is research, companies always want to keep up with that demand to begin with, right? If you probably don't accept government funding, you also then have to trade off a lot of things, right? I will use opening ops example exactly here, right? That Pfizer needed probably some sort of funding to innovate the way it did. What was the type of data that Pfizer got from the government? It was in terms of how many people are contracting COVID, or exactly in which hospital, what type of virus is being contracted. These are specific information that only the government of a country has exclusive monopoly over, and only the government has access to, which means since we're talking about research which are for publicly demanded goods, the best actor for you to give data on this research is the government, which means companies will still have an incentive to collaborate with the government, because in absence of that, they cannot do the research to begin with, right? Because these require massive data to begin with, which means companies, even with the patent in place, will want to work with governments to begin with, right? But governments, on the other hand, still have an incentive to keep providing funds to these people, right? Because again, as I mentioned, that these have a lot of demand, which means governments do want to make sure that that demand is met. The last concern that remains from side opposition is in regards to the point at which you won't have government oversight, you will probably have more things like animal testing and whatnot. It's absolutely absurd for them to claim this, because they themselves say these are big companies who are probably investing in research. If that is so, they definitely have shareholders, they definitely care about their reputation. We have an increasing consumer mindset which are very aware and woke about all of these things, and they themselves tell you that there will be a lot of peer review, there will be a lot of information being freely flown. If that is the case, I don't think this like researchers are going to do animal testing and whatnot, which means transparency is still not a problem. The conclusion of all of this is, the question is whether or not you will still have research for life-saving drugs. After passing this policy, you still have. The second question is, do you need the government? You most absolutely do. Otherwise, these sorts of research probably would not uniquely pass. Then what is this exclusive trade-off in the debate, right? Probably some big companies will not get the royalties for those specific periods of time in exchange, right? Are these royalties really that important for these companies? Because I think as opening opposition themselves say that after a few years, they do get an artificial monopoly, which means even if you're talking about a time restriction, they do have the artificial monopoly to begin with. And as we mentioned, that the developing countries do not have the infrastructure to develop this later on once there is already an artificial monopoly. I don't think after 30 or 40 years, these companies will be able to break into this scenario to begin with, which is the specific cost of the time restriction, right? But I also absolutely agree with opening up in regards to the artificial monopoly that is created, which means the cost here is, if you pass this motion and if you allow these public research goods to be patented, even after 30 or 40 years, the access is still going to be definitely restricted if we agree with LO's characterization. But on other side, these certain privileged companies and certain privileged researchers probably don't get some royalty to begin with. I think they still want to innovate and still want to continue their research for three specific reasons. The first of which is, number one, the people who are doing this research are generally passionate about it, because I agree with them that research takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. I don't think you're going to wake up and one day and be like, okay, at some point in time, I will get a lot of money, which is why I'm going to like waste the next 50 years of my life over a research. No, these people are generally interested within this. They probably had an academic background in this, which means there is passion, which will still be the driving force for these researchers. Number two, there is also internal competition within the industry to begin with, which means if you're not researching, some other researchers will, which means you still have an incentive to research on this. But number three, it's just very fucking good PR, right? Even if you don't get the extra amount of money, you'll still probably win some Nobel Prize or whatnot shit out there that is there for research, scientific research and whatnot, which means you still won that positive PR and that recognition to begin with. But the added layer of money that you were supposed to get wasn't going to go to individual researchers. It was going to go to big ass corporations who already are pretty fucking rich, right? So I don't understand why there is an absolute necessity to restrict the rights and accessibility of public goods from the most vulnerable people within the society to give what extra $50,000 to Pfizer. I don't think Pfizer has any value and they would still be producing regardless. What is the specific cost here before I move on? Closing. 1, 2, 3. Okay. So what's the specific cost here in terms of these vulnerable people, right? I think these are three folds. Number one, the point at which there is a lot of patent on these public goods. Number one, end price for consumers are going to increase, right? Because in developing countries, if you want to like export those stuff, even if they give you all the information, you are not being able to locally manufacture them because of the way in which, as they themselves say, there's going to be artificial monopoly and you can replicate it. If that is the scenario, the cost for the end consumer is going to increase. But number two, the manufacturing cost is also going to increase for you. But number three, you probably have to transport a lot of things in terms of the supply chain because you do not have this specific knowledge. I think it's absolutely ridiculous for op to claim that, oh, there is free flow of knowledge. I mean, that's not really how patent works. Probably some patents and some very generous companies do that, but most patents don't give you the specific ways in which you make something, right? That is literally the idea of patent. Royalties are a part of it, but not all patents are like that. They will give you all the information to begin with, right? I don't think they can have the best of both worlds. If that is the case, then the conclusion here is the end cost for every single consumer is increasing. The conclusion is there is definitely going to be a restriction on these public goods for these people to afford. I think then the question in this debate is whether or not you want to give 50,000 or 100,000 extra dollars to Pfizer, or you want to make sure that people on the ground are able to afford cancer producing drugs and whatnot. I think that is exactly why you need to vote OG. Very proud to win. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Accessibility is not just a matter of the short-term ability for individuals to gain access to scientific solutions. This is a debate about how we can sustainably create long-term long-term structural incentives to make sure that we are able to sustainably pursue our scientific innovation and solutions in a market that is very relatively guided by profit incentive and the ability for people to make economic benefit of the scientific solutions that they're trying to innovate. And that is where patents come in. Because our case was a case of why competitive pressures that were created by these patents improve the overall global pool of solutions available scientifically for people. Three things in this speech. First, is this policy principally just? Second, what do least economically developed countries do, LEDCs in other words? And thirdly, how important are royalties? And now I'll go into an argument about why this is important for accessibility, accountability. Let's first discuss this issue on principle, because I think their entire case is principle, and I don't want to be unresponsive to this because principles are good arguments. One thing that I want to point out here is that the access to information is odd for them to suggest is what is needed to be redistributed, because it is the product of that information and that research that's important for the lay person, not the raw data. So it isn't about accessing raw data per se, it's about making sure you are able to access those kinds of products. And the argument, therefore, in principle on their side is unnuanced because it is an argument for increasing access by subsidizing the products of that research information. They've not given us a reason why that information needs to be made publicly available to every single person out there. But more importantly, we told you already that there was a degree of transparency that was required. And I pointed this out in a POI that was quite generous to the opening graph, because I think that right now what it looks like is that there has to be peer reviews, there has to be cross-cultural studies, cross-studies for these particular scientific products in order to be seen as legitimate and empirically proven to be true. Like the process of empiricism in scientific research demands that kind of rigor and transparency. So the level of transparency in the information that we get on our side, the level of access to scientific knowledge on our side isn't obscured completely to the scale whereby it possibly completely hinders any sort of innovation. Guys, if you look at like the coronavirus vaccines, the first patents that were the first designs, the prototypes of like of the Oxford group of Oxford University's vaccine, all those things were out there for the public to know. Whether or not the methodology and the way they reached there, all those things were all out there for people to discern. The question is, what is the final chemical formulation? What's the final data and all that becomes eventually published after some longitudinal studies over time. So it isn't because of patents that we don't review information right now. It's because of the need for us to accumulate data before making a conclusion. That is the reason why we don't see the immediate disclosure of information. So these guys on opening graph have no knowledge of how the scientific industry works. They've conflated the lack of information, the lack of immediate information, with the broader like lack of restrictiveness of patents. So that's just not the debate. Yeah. So I want to point out that the principal argument isn't it for this debate. Second, what I want to talk about then is the thing that James talks about, because James brilliantly argues to you here in this debate that it is about increasing the quantity and the quality of cutting-edge research, and you can't do this if patents are not the competitive pressures that force smaller companies to come up with something on their own and not leech off the scientific innovations of the big companies. We think this is very important, and I think it works both ways. Like if you want to talk about like taxing and things like that, I want to talk about how important royalties are for a moment here. I want to point out that royalties are directly in principle with the principle of taxation behind taxation, which is redistributive justice. Because the royalties that you get right now is part of the general, it's trying to capture the broader collective positive externalities enjoyed by the global community, by the entire world, when your research and your labor, your intellectual labor has benefited this particular product or this particular area of science. That royalty is in fact a form of tax on the positive externality. Try and include it into the market's calculation. We think that's the principle that we stand for here. It is not distinct from the redistributive justice principle that we get in taxation right now. It's unclear why, if these guys stand for taxing companies, that they wouldn't stand for trying to redistribute the profit in a way that is fair for the players of the market, so that players of the market don't have the perverse incentive to all retreat into the private sector and to be only privately funded, so that there is no accountability whatsoever. Before I move on, closing Duff.
Yeah, so I'm genuinely confused. If the corporation really wants some take of this patent, why not they negotiate to like fund 10 or 20% and therefore like they've got the right to patent?
Wait, so like that's not really the point. The point here is that there are some bodies that are government funded, think tanks that are government funded. Those kinds of think tanks that have these very good talent are now forced into the private sector because they feel the funding crunch when royalties are not paid to their think tank. That's when they get out-competed by the resource pool that goes into that the private sector has, that the private sector is able to leverage on. Right now, because your side doesn't have patents for those government-owned companies like A-Star, by the way, like that's the reason why you guys will end up having the loss of talent into the private sector, because they want to do research. Like what Megha says in her speech, because Megha says that this is about them who are passionate. If they are passionate, passion doesn't mean that you can create the best forms of research for yourself to make your career fulfilling. All those things can only be done if you are finding yourself in an environment that is supportive, that you don't feel resource crunches for, that you don't feel that there's a timeline for you to basically show your surplus, your surplus of research because X amount of money has gone into this, and therefore you can't make money from your company or your think tank will not benefit from the direct royalties that come along with it. All of that means to say that you feel things like funding crunches, salary crunches, all that means that those people go into those private companies, and then that's where you have the oversight problem, where these particular the public oversight over these particular experiments become very, very few. That's why you see things like, for example, shady experimental treatments on minorities, especially Native Americans and like Indigenous Australians who tend to be afflicted by chronic ailments, but then are being selected by these particular corporations who have very, very, very dodgy ethics boards. So I want to point out here that as a matter of accountability, they lose out in the long term. So what then do LEDCs do? So LEDCs in this debate end up basically having to come up with their own solution scientifically because of after making observations of what happens in the global scene. So for example, China's Sinopharm and Sinovac and India's current vaccine and even Russia's vaccine are all a result of directly observing how these particular corporations in the West have tried to come up with technology, and they try to hybridize this to come up with new solutions, and then they patent that new solution so that they can earn royalties off it for their own population to make it accessible. All things considered, the royalties are going back into funding the taxpayers' pool of available resources. That's the reason why in the long term, we get more access to good solutions and not just a stagnant pool of global scientific solutions. For these reasons, we are proud to oppose.
Thank you. To begin the closing half of this debate, I'd like to invite the member of Gov.
Yeah, sorry, give me a moment. Right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So I'm genuinely quite confused, and I really don't know if it's just me. But I just want to set up what I think is a reasonable debate, because I think a large chunk of what OO runs as their argumentation just doesn't really make, as set up, just doesn't really make a lot of sense. And the reason for that is, as I asked Joel, right, if this was really about the ability to incentivize any kind of research, if your corporations really thought that this was research that they were willing to get in on, then they would probably negotiate for partial funding on that side of the house. Number one. Number two, it assumes that there is no such thing as governmental think tanks, which draw backtracks on and suggest that there are. So I think the reality is that the reasonable counter model, and this is actually me being charitable to them, because the debate is easier for us to win on those grounds, is that it is unlikely that what happens is the state throws billions of dollars of taxpayer funding and the corporation takes the pattern. Just because this makes no logical sense, but also makes the OG's argument strongest in that particular frame, because that means that we are literally as taxpayers choosing to subsidize a private corporation and the money of a rich individual. Therefore, I think what's more likely is ops world is one where in the status quo, when the state chooses to fund via the corporation, and so they pay the corporation fully to do this research, that is a world in which the state continues to own this particular pattern to a very significant degree rather than the corporation. It is a world where in the status quo, the profit that comes from corporations is through things like manufacturing, through things like the exclusive contract to manufacture the drug, for instance, but at a price that is reasonable for the state. It's also the status quo that that state will pay think tanks or use their own research departments to fund the kind of research that comes out. So that means at the end of the day that I think the question is whether the state should, as an actor, be able to hold these particular patterns or not. That just seems more reasonable to me. I would take any clarificatory POI because I'm as confused as everyone else. What kind of research are we talking about, therefore? I think the conclusion, therefore, is that in order for a state to be entirely funding the research rather than partially funding, which is the status quo of most research, including, as opening up concede, the COVID vaccines. These are instances where the state determines that there is absolutely no way in which the money from the product of this research can be gatekept in any way to any extent from public use and for anybody to therefore be able to take on. Therefore, that's why the state in the status quo takes on the extreme cost of funding 100% of this research in the status quo. This therefore probably looks like incredibly important vaccines and drugs that they determine they cannot lose any control over. Yes, Joel.
So in that case, like those companies that are funded maybe by 10 to 20% of their funding from like the government resources, they would also have some degree of oversight because there's an accountability for how you spend that 20%, right?
Yeah, Gav is wrong. OG is wrong. Yeah. Second, so to that degree, given that context, why is this in principle a necessary move insofar as you consider what's right and wrong within the field of knowledge? And here I want to get past like this OO claim that the knowledge is out there, but you can't use it. That is not meaningful for two reasons. The first is that insofar as the knowledge is out there, the cost that like corporations or states in the status quo make a decision that the relative value of allowing other people to manufacture with your patented knowledge is less than what the value that you would have if you continue to keep a monopoly over that patented knowledge, which in turn means that the prices are driven up anyway. But secondly, also, the fact that you can profit is inherently a claim to property that we think is fundamentally wrong on our side of the house. Why? The first question I want to ask is what right to ownership anyone has over scientific knowledge. And I'm going to suggest that it is minimal for two key reasons. The first is that knowledge acquisition is inherently arbitrary. There is no good way at the point at which you start like the process of scientific experimentation to determine for sure which is a better or wrong method to approaching research. What you choose to take on, therefore, and who actually gets it right is ultimately more often than not a question of luck. I recognize that people like Edison did try to make a light bulb 1,000 times, and good for him. But the reality is that in the status quo world where everybody tries to do the same thing, because the knowledge of where the gaps are generally universal and also tend to exist in peer-reviewed articles, journal articles that say we need research in these particular areas, who gets to the end of the outcome of this research is fundamentally arbitrary, which makes the subsequent claim to ownership extremely morally arbitrary. But second and more pertinently, knowledge builds off past knowledge. It builds off the past research that other individuals have done, number one. But secondly, also builds off the fact that other people try and fail, and therefore you know not to try that same thing. The implication of this is that I think the concept of patents is inherently morally arbitrary and flawed in terms of the ability for people to gatekeep and claim ownership and profit of this particular knowledge. But I agree with OO. Patents exist in the status quo, and I suggest they exist for two reasons. The first I would posit is just because people happen to want money and created structures that allow them to profit to the maximum. But second, that patents exist because we decided that the existence of knowledge was better than our claims over, was more important than our claims over who deserved or didn't deserve to have knowledge. And therefore we thought it was a necessary means to an end of knowledge on that side of the house. Why does this not apply in the case of states? Two reasons. The first is that insofar as you want to consider profit, we don't think this should exist. I recognize that taxpayer money may be used to fund this, but the problem with this argumentation is that the taxpayer rarely, if ever, sees the full extent of this knowledge. And the reason for this is exactly what Joel says, because a lot of this money, the profit from this knowledge goes back into the think tanks that you talk about. Therefore, meaning that the think tanks get this money and churn out more and more research, but it doesn't actually benefit the consumer. The most direct way the consumer is benefited is by having accessible drugs, for example, which is reduced on that side of the house. But secondly, the problem is that this idea of needing patents as a means to the end of knowledge doesn't exist in this situation for two reasons. The first is that insofar as the state chooses to fund this presumably exists because democratic incentive structures exist that require it to spend this degree of money insofar as the state is not inherently profit motivated. These democratic incentives stay the same on both sides of the house because the need for research stays the same, which means that we are again able to avoid this immoral trap of patents. But the second thing to note is I think states are a uniquely poor actor to hold knowledge. And the reason for this is that your ability to partake in a state is fundamentally exclusionary. In a corporation, it is theoretically the case that if you want to throw your money in to be a shareholder, anybody can do so. With a state, arbitrary borders dictate who is going to be within that polity that has access or does not have access to this knowledge. The fact that individuals are left out of this knowledge too means they are completely undignified. And therefore, the ability to gain access cheaply to the outputs of this knowledge is fundamentally immoral. And therefore, we think on those grounds, the concept of states being the same as corporations and holding patents is fundamentally false. Second, why do we get better research? This argument is very simple. The problem in the status quo is that even when states fund research entirely. They perceive that through things, because of things like national pride or through the concept of getting profit for the think tank in the future, these think tanks have an incentive to block out collaboration to minimize the number of people who have to share this particular slice of the pie. The implication of this is that, contrary to what Joel says, this reduces the extent to which people are able to get more minds in on this knowledge, share the burden of cost of this knowledge, because they are trying to gatekeep the output of knowledge that exists. On our side of the house, specific to types of knowledge that we recognize are absolutely necessary, and that's why the state funds it. We think on our side of the house, we have a better chance of getting better quality knowledge faster at the point that we increase the likelihood of collaboration that just doesn't exist when you want to be able to claim ownership of this knowledge on op bench. That is what we propose.
Thank you. Member of Up, please. Yep, I can see you.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. CEO coming to this bit is going to tell you two extensions. Firstly, how we create greater funding, and secondly, how we protect the most vulnerable group of people. Before I continue, I just want to take out what CG told you, because CG told you that the state should own this particular patterns, this publicly funded patterns. Firstly, we think that this debate is about eliminating all forms of pattern, like it says in the motion, i.e. nobody holds this pattern. I don't think they prove why this frame overtakes the other frames coming out from opening, so I don't think that their frame is particularly correct. Secondly, all the harms of innovation still exist, right? Because private companies still don't want to innovate. It's unclear why companies will be willing to accept public funding at the point where they know they cannot make any forms of profit. What's likely to happen is that they don't do research into these particular areas, or they go out to seek private investors at the point in which this debate doesn't really affect these groups of companies. They then tell you that there's the claim to the property of knowledge is in and of itself principally wrong. But at the point, you have to realize that when innovation is occurring, you have to invest a lot of money and your own forms of assets into these kinds of things, right? Which is to say that you still have a stake, you still have the ability, you still have some principle to own the kinds of research that's happening, right? We recognize that Albert Einstein created the E equals to MC square. We believe he still has some he still has a principal stake, being the one that who created that particular equation, for example. OG's case is better, right? They tell you that accessibility is important and their side creates greater accessibility. The problem is that nobody would want to innovate, right? Instead, what happens is that people just wait for first mover to innovate and then copy. And then we think this is problematic because it creates time lag, right? At the point where these kinds of drugs for important people, for people who really need it, don't come out. And therefore people suffer. But we think also that we think there are ways in which governments can create greater accessibility through things like subsidizing these kind of drugs. Even if governments don't fund these kind of things, we think that there are still private companies like insurance agencies that can still provide subsidies to these kind of funds, or directly funding these consumers the amount of the kinds of drugs that are really expensive. They then tell you that developing countries cannot develop further. I don't understand how it is that removing patents will suddenly boost the research capabilities of developing countries, given the inability of developing countries to innovate lies within structural problems. In fact, it's under their side where developing countries are unable to develop more, right? Because they need public funding given their infrastructural problems, which is to say that private companies can take the research and monopolize it. But even if it's true that governments at the end of the day, we don't think that they get any form of innovations whatsoever. I'm going to answer why is it. I'm not going to answer why is it that we create greater funding for people. We need to understand that companies don't just take public funding, right? They also have to take private funding to create more funding. The point is that people are so OG tells us that people are willing to innovate. We tell you that no, people are inherently selfish, that if there's no benefits to conduct research, then nobody will. Yes, there are some people who are inherently altruistic, but the vast majority of people simply don't care about these kinds of issues and therefore don't have an incentive to conduct any research. Why is our side more likely? Because research and development is an arduous journey, right? There's a chance that it will fail and it takes a really long time. Meaning to say that there's a big disincentive to innovate, even if they are truly passionate about these kinds of subjects. But more than this, there are probably only some people that really are geniuses that can conduct these kinds of innovations, which is precisely why you need to create an incentive for these people to come in and engage with these kinds of industries. But also government funding is not enough, right? There's an opportunity cost, so governments aren't going to fully fund these kinds of research, which is to say that oftentimes these companies need to get private investors as well who only care about really earning money. When at the point, what government funding is then done is to kickstart these kinds of research and development so that these companies can go towards private investors and as a proof of concept to show that, look, there's an opportunity to make money here, so give us your money so we can continue these kinds of research and development. This is important because we recognize that funding is really important for these kinds of innovations. You need to do things like fund staff, fund the kinds of research and facilities required to conduct these kinds of research, which is to say that under their side, they take away the ability for these companies to seek out these kinds of private investors, which means that the companies that are trying to innovate into this kind in the sectors that we're talking about don't have the ability to gain additional private investors and don't have the funds necessary in order to continue innovating. Okay. Second extension, why is it why public funding is required to why these patents are required to create innovation in niche topics. If OG's principle, right, is that they want to protect the most vulnerable group of people, we do it better. We need to recognize that, like, okay, firstly, we think that governments are willing to fund research into niche subjects, because I think OG already mentioned that governments are incentivized to provide funding to protect the most vulnerable groups, right, and protect the ones who are protect the ones that are developing the group these goods. The reality is that these kinds of niche like research, right? For example, illnesses that are not experienced by the vast majority of people simply mean that like companies don't have a great incentive to like invest in these kinds of drugs by nature of them not being as profitable as like drugs that affect the vast majority of people. So this looks like toxoplasmosis, for example. What patents do, right, is patents prevent companies from simply waiting. Firstly, patents like prevent companies from simply waiting around to steal an idea and make money from it. But it also gives incentive to conduct research and development into these kinds of areas, right? Because they can make profit from these kinds of research. The comparative is that without patents, there's no reasons for companies to conduct any research given that their intellectual property can be stolen. Therefore, like, patents are important because they prevent other people from using this research and like the development for their own profit gain. In the context of publicly funded research, these companies target specific like niche subjects. This looks like drugs to combat disease illnesses faced by a small minority of populations, such as toxoplasmosis, in which like bigger companies like Pfizer don't really care about. The problem here is that how in which like profit is made from these kinds of industries, that yes, they can jack up the prices of these kinds of drugs. And that's how they are able to make profit from these kinds of industries. The point is that we think that at the point where you give government funding, it's a point in which there's the ability for them to like create these kinds of innovations, kind of drugs. Before I continue, I'll take one from opening.
Look, we already told you this specific type of research need government data to survive. Your alternatives like insurance companies can provide this data, but the cost is that you probably have an artificial monopoly that you cannot compete with. And within the 30 or 40 years, the cost drastically rise. Please engage.
We think that that's ultimately better than having no drugs for these people whatsoever, right? We think that's comparatively better. But also like recognize that at the point in which other companies see that like there's an ability to make profits in these kinds of industries, the point where other companies will then enter the market and therefore drive the prices of these kind of drugs lower in the long run. So like we think that this looks like research into certain technologies to improve the lives of people, like living on mountains, like hanging cliffs or whatever, right? Why is it that it's problematic when you eliminate the patents? Is that companies have no reasons to engage with these kinds of niche markets. It's problematic because two scenarios happen: either no drugs to protect the people or no improvement to people's lives, and therefore people suffer, or that this technology exists that hasn't been improved, i.e. like there are film which has a lot of negative side effects and hasn't been developed for these kinds of industries. We think that this is bad for people who consume the drugs. We're going to buy the bullet. Yes, like prices will increase, but we think that this can be reduced at the point where other companies see profit can be made, enter the market and reduce the prices. We think that there are subsidies that can be done also. But under their side, recognize that no innovation happens and the most vulnerable groups of people suffer because there's no drugs for these people or technology help these individuals. For all these reasons, please oppose.
Thanks. I'd like to invite the last speaker off the bench. Kabir, please.
Oh, sorry. Am I audible now?
Yep.
Okay, great.
please.
Sorry, just give me a moment to set up my timer. Setting my speech in. Sorry, can I be heard?
Yep, I can hear you well.
Okay, thank you. Setting my speech in 3, 2, 1. It's unclear why the bulk of the benefits that CG wants to talk about having, knowledge transcend boundaries towards the developing world actually stands within this debate, because we note that, after all, at the end of the day, this motion is about using public funds to fund this scientific research. And if we're already going on the analysis brought up by the government that if people are already not getting access to the drugs that they want, I'm really unsure why the secondary nature of, doing good, like socially or internationally through the transmission of information should actually take center stage, right? So but even we engage on their point about how it's important to have these knowledge get access by a developing country for them to have innovations, I'm really unclear how then they would have the ability to, let's say, take on more additional advanced stages of manufacturing in order to manufacture these forms of goods. It's more likely that once you start off with this knowledge transmission, you're more likely to need to then go on to do some technological transfers, and that in itself is again on the onus of whether these governments will want to do so, given the rise of protectionism or the possible cause that when these countries are able to produce generic drugs, you possibly have a direct competition against your own trademark drugs within your country, right? But more importantly, it's also the point about knowledge sharing, because I'm really unclear how then knowledge sharing immediately leads to more collaboration, as Sean likes to posit. Because note, right, at a point in which you have knowledge publicly available and you do without the patents, but what Wayne said, this sets companies back from actually wanting to innovate, right? Because now companies will look to other companies for their information. This leads to more of a collective action problem, where because companies know that there's publicly available information, if they wait for longer, they most probably want to wait for other first movers to take the lead, so they do not have to invest as much resources into the research and innovation that's particularly being needed. And this leads to a timeline because companies are just waiting on each other to innovate, and this is not the world that we want to live in, right? And it's completely wrong for Isaac to say that profit is out of this equation, because no, as much as they would like to say drugs such as vaccines are very important for the third world, note that these are ultimately not public goods, right? Rich countries fund them, and in order for them to be transmitted to the third world, you will need funding by these rich countries that buy them above cost price in order to be able to channel to these goods. So now we establish that there's actually a profit incentive that exists within this scientific research. And why is this very important to point out? Because we need to note that scientific research is usually a partnership between the government that's willing to fund it and the private company that has the labs and has the talent in order to take it on, right? And this is where patents come in as particularly important, because patents act as a form of insurance for these big private companies to say that if they were actually going to devote their manpower, they're going to devote their utilities into developing these drugs, that they're likely to be able to then get the benefits from doing so instead of having to share it with other corporations, right? But then when we actually talk about this, then we meet another point when it comes to, let's say, consumer accessibility. And this is what OG directly wants to talk about, that now companies start to monopolize the drug market and reduce the ability for the less vulnerable people to actually take the drug. And this is when Wayne's extension comes in as particularly important, because we actually challenge the characterization that comes out of OG about what kinds of drugs that governments actually fund, right? OG likes to say that the drugs that governments fund are usually drugs that are of high in demand. That's what people want. But we'll actually say that is actually the counter of it, because note, right, when the drugs are in high in demand and there are people that want it, naturally private investors with more profit incentives will want to come and fund them because they know that they can reap money off of it. But when it comes to niche drugs, right, that needs to be funded even before anybody believes in it, the government is the first mover to do this because of the fact that they do not operate on profit incentive, but instead operate on social welfare. Hence, if the government knows that there's a small amount of people in the country that needs the drug, they're just more likely to go into the market in order to invest in these drugs and to fund these drugs, right? And why this is uniquely important, because now the information, now the metric is no longer about access and whether or not companies monopolize these drugs and then have high prices and reduces access, but whether or not the drugs even exist in the first place. Because we know the most popular drugs that you see right now in the market most probably had the government as the first investor in order to have these research and innovation go through, right? Because private investors will only want to come in at the point when they know that the drug is efficacious, right? So in the beginning stages, it's more likely that the governments are the one that are funding these trials and funding this long drawn out process, right? So this means that necessarily, if you do not have the patents where companies are then, naturally assured that, they will not have any form of losing out in terms of trade, these companies would then not want to take on this innovation. At the same time, you will not have these drugs because the government in the first place will not be willing to come in to even fund these drugs in the first place, right? And they want to have all these added on benefits about like economic growth and about how these drugs can actually lead the country to have more ground. But I think that this is actually counterintuitive to that point, right? When you talk about like reducing patents and the ability for individual companies to have ownership over the processes of what they do, all you're likely to see is a full-on like competition within the industry where individuals now know that they have similar processes, but will instead seek to outcompete one another in terms of other means, be it like predatory pricing or more added-on incentives. And this can have two outcomes. One is that even if predatory pricing occurs, we say that this works in our favor, and if we take down the best case, it actually improves the access of consumers to these forms of drugs, because now companies know that they have to beat one another in terms of lower prices in order to segment themselves from the market, given that they have similar properties and processes, right? But another thing is that you're more likely then if you're more likely then to not get that form of like innovation. So before I move on, I'll get a POI from OG.
Ignoring all the new material from op-ed, this debate is not about whether or not patents are good in general or you will have any life-saving drugs or not. Question is whether or not for 30 years you'll make people pay a lot more for life-saving drugs or not.
Yeah. So we told you that is not likely going to be the case, right? Because based on the added benefits that I told you, right? Given that in the instance where you actually remove patents, you're just all the more likely going to have competition within the individual companies in order to segment themselves, right? And in order to segment themselves, right? And this more possibly can lead to impacts where there's just inherent competition, right? So we say on our side, where you're just likely to have the patent, it's more likely then that companies would not engage in all these predatory practices, and there's just more likelihood, I think, for this competition to just come in, because now companies know that whatever they innovate within the circle will be uniquely protected, instead of having like being stolen by other countries or by other countries and even other companies, right? So this is what the unique guarantee of a patent does on our side of the house. So we've uniquely shown you how on our side of the house, notwithstanding all the information about transmission to developing countries, how profit is part of the question, and in order for any form of meaningful scientific research to occur, there must be an incentive on these private companies who want to take on the research, and we actively guarantee that. So for all that reason, I'm very proud to stand our opposition.
All right, thank you guys for that round. You may virtually cross the floor. I just want to double check. The debaters just go out of the main, like you guys go to the main room, right?
I think that's what I heard.
Okay, all right. You may proceed to the main room. Thank you.